everybody, and thank you for joining us for our second wonderful talk of the day to help us celebrate Salem Women's History Day. We hope that everybody has had the chance to take advantage of all the wonderful things that are going on in the community, and we were thrilled to have Dina Vargo here to talk about the Wild Women of Boston and make some connections with the settlement movement. And we are also thrilled to have Robin Woodman here too. She's a longtime supporter and volunteer at the Gables. She's a member of our education committee. And she has a kind of historical interest in both we like to call them our strong women of the Gables, both Susanna Ingersoll and also Caroline Emerton, who each in their own right have really made the Gables what it is today. The Gables is a place where we have a dual mission of preservation and education that was really highlighted by Caroline Emerton, and I'm sure Robin will be touching on that, so I don't want to steal her thunder. But we are absolutely delighted to welcome you and have you here today. So.
Well, welcome everybody to the House of the Seven Gables celebration of Salem's Women's History Day. I want to thank Julie for inviting me back again this year for this special day in Salem Women's History. I do hope that some of you were able to attend Dina's talk earlier, or Caroline Emerton. If not, please stop by the museum store and pick up the book on the way out. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. As most of you know, or are aware, I'm sure, Caroline Emerton was the driving force behind the salvation and preservation of the House of the Seven Gables, as well as a force to be reckoned with in Salem, period. Present-day Salem owes her a debt of gratitude. Without her vision and philanthropy of the early 1900s, Salem would look and be a much different city in the 21st century. The honor of Person of the Century was as bestowed on her by the Salem News in 1999 is well-deserved and fitting for a talk today about the strong, yet less-known women of this storied house. Fortunately for us, Caroline lived in an era, and let's face it, a social class, that was tolerant of her activism despite her femaleness. It's not completely understood, if not completely understood and supported, her vision and voice were realized. Her history and her story was recorded. We know as much about Caroline as the time she lived in would allow. However, Caroline was only one of a long line of strong, determined, and forceful women who witnessed a great deal of history through the multi-pane windows of this great house. But sadly, as in the case with nearly all women's history, unless a woman herself wrote down in the form of a journal or a diary her vision, her voice, her history, her life was not recorded. The great writer Virginia Woolf, in her semi-biographical story The Legacy, which focuses on reading and interpreting diaries, recounts what the self-absorbed widower Gilbert Clarendon states after reading his dead wife Angela's 15-volume diary of her life with him. A diary which she records the responsibilities and the turmoils of her life as the wife of a prominent politician, relating some of the heartbreaking stories of some of his constituents and her trying to help them get jobs or make life a little easier for them in some small way. Gilbert, in his all-too-typical response, dismisses the recording of Angela's life as having left nothing in particular behind. I'm glad I got that response. Well, in some small effort to give voice to the founding women of the Gables on the Salem Women's History Day, I would like to attempt to introduce you to these extraordinary women who, although left no written history of their journey that has yet to be discovered, they left an indelible mark in each generation that followed. Since most history of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century are often written from 3 points of view, that is, generally, written history is about war. It is written from the victor's point of view of that war, and as a result, it is written by the writer's, usually male, point of view. Consequently, to get at women's history at this age, we must go through these avenues to construct what the women were doing. It may come as no surprise that women back then were doing pretty much as what women were doing now. That is, they were having and raising families, working around the house and gardens, and trying to create a better future for their children. And during times of war, they were doing so much more. As everyone who has taken a tour of the house is aware, It was originally built in 1668 by John Turner, who was referred to as Captain John Turner or John Turner I, and his wife Elizabeth Roberts. John was born in Boston, September in 1644 of Robert, a shoemaker, and Elizabeth Freestone. Both John's parents arrived from England in the 1630s, and John was probably an indentured servant that worked his way into freedom. When Robert died in 1651, he left his widow Elizabeth a thriving business, including an inventory of over 100 hats and nearly countless pairs of shoes. At the time of his father's death, John was 7 years old, and he had a younger brother and sister. 2 other siblings had died as infants. Elizabeth Freestone Turner then married George Gardner, mariner of Salem, bringing her and her children to live in Salem. In 1668, John I married Elizabeth Roberts and began building the seaside house. Although he was just 24 years old and she 21, by this time John was an established Salem mariner and merchant. He would become one of the wealthiest merchants in Salem in the 17th century by sailing and owning a number of ships, wharves, and warehouses. With this social standing came great responsibility, and along with the city records that show that John was often called upon to participate in jury duty, to be a selectman, to contribute to the cost of building roads, and supply the fort with gunpowder. The inventory of his estate shows that John and Elizabeth were very social and entertained in both the mansion house here, as well as the summer house that they built and entertained in on Baker's Island. 10 years after building this house, John and Elizabeth were able to be extravagant and leased Baker's Island from the town for £3 a year for the next 1,000 years. All in all, Captain John and Elizabeth Turner became prominent and important citizens in Salem. Perhaps it was the hostilities that erupted in the summer of 1675 between the British settlers of Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag Indians, that commanded by Philip, their leader, that led the Turners to seek refuge away from the town into a potential safe haven out on Baker's Island. Known as King Philip's War, this vicious and bloody conflict was spread throughout southern New England. I think I have a map of that. Yeah. Mostly that orange is where most of the battles took place. Not long after the attacks began, a group commanded under the Captain Thomas Lathrop of Salem, made up of soldiers from Beverly and Salem, was sent westward to fight because the company was mostly made up of Essex County men. They were dubbed the Flower of Essex, which doesn't seem appropriate for a war, but... In September of 1675, while escorting weapons full of grain through the town of South Deerfield, so that would be more in the upper middle part of that orange there, the company was ambushed along a marsh known as Muddy Brook. Captain Lathrop and 54 of the men from Essex County were killed. A company led by Captain Mosley was 6 miles away and heard the fighting. They rushed to the area, but they were too late. Captain Mosley was killed immediately, and his second-in-command, Lieutenant John Pickering of Salem, took over the company. From that time on the spot that spot has been referred to as Bloody Brook, prompting the Reverend William Hubbard of Essex County, who knew most of the men who had perished, to declare it that most fatal day, the saddest day that ever befell New England. Although we don't know if John Turner took part in that war, as he was listed as serving with George Gardner and under the command of Samuel Gardner. We just don't know if he was there. Chances are he was, because he would have been part of the Essex County Brigade. And although no battles took place in the area of the North Shore during this conflict, we can surely try to imagine what Elizabeth Turner was going through while John was away. Indian attacks were a constant threat throughout the villages and towns. After many Indian raids occurred in Wells, Maine, which at the time was part of the Massachusetts colony, many frightened people relocated to Salem. Survivors of these attacks told their stories to the town folks, describing the burning of entire towns to the ground and the capture and killing of women and children. This conflict was right on the doorstep of towns and villages such as Salem, so just imagine the thoughts the women would have been having on a daily basis. Surely some women would have left and perhaps returned to England to escape the constant threat and anxiety of these times. And yet it is during these times of unrest that some women emerge from their social structure, confinement, and do extraordinary things. During the course of King Philip's War, women constructed bulwarks across the river, the Charles River, to protect Boston from invasion. After one attack in Wells, women in the garrison fired upon the enemy. Others overpowered the guards to beat, behead, and dismember two bound Wabanaki captives. A quick-thinking Dorchester maid hid the children under brass kettles, and when the Indian appeared at the door one July Sunday, she then pitched shovelfuls of live coals in his face. Hannah Dunstan tomahawked her Indian captors after they murdered her newborn baby before her eyes. She scalped her victims before escaping, or at least that's what Cotton Mather told us she did. Stacy Schiff states that the captivity narrative glorified those formidable women and their daring displays. At a time of shuddering devastation, they stepped in as the dragon slayers. Well, what type of woman was Elizabeth? By this time in the 1675, I just want to see. Have I got this backwards? There we go. By this time in 1675, she had 3 children. John was born in 1671 and would be 4 years old, and Elizabeth was born in 73. She was 2 years old at the time John was away fighting. During the time of the Bloody Brook Massacre, Elizabeth was at least 4 months pregnant with Eunice, who would be born on January 1st, 1676. The conflict continued from the summer of 75 into the spring of 76, a time when most people were focused and concentrated on getting prepared for the long New England winter. So how did this 30-year-old pregnant mother of 2 cope with the fear and anxiety of a potential vicious Indian attack occurring at any time, along with the fear of losing her husband during this conflict? Many men had left Salem to participate in this long-forgotten but historically important war, and we could surmise that Elizabeth was not alone in her anxiety. I feel that Elizabeth was probably a dragon slayer. We know that she did not, although she had the means to uproot her children and escape, she did not do that. She was able to keep her household and children safe and still give birth to a healthy baby girl in January. In the next few years, Elizabeth would give birth to 2 other children, Freestone and Abiel, who was born in October of 1680. 5 days after Captain John Turner's sudden and unexpected death on October 9th, he had just turned 36 years old. Elizabeth Robert Turner's life after the death of Captain John Turner I support the conviction that she had to remain engaged during King Philip's conflict. Her strength and her determination to stay put certainly showed through at that time. She was left to raise 5 children. Having just given birth, she filed an inventory of John's estate a few weeks after his death, listing over 1,200 pounds worth of goods. But apparently a fuller inventory was conducted in November, and the value of the estate was 6,788 pounds, a great deal of money at that time. She certainly had the means to leave the area if she had some place to go. We don't know what she did, but she could have gone anywhere. But she stayed. According to James Duncan Phillips, a prolific Salem historian, most widows and widowers, especially those with children, married within months of the death of a spouse. Remember, these were exceptionally harsh and difficult times. But Elizabeth did not remarry until September of 1685, 5 years after the death of John. According to town records, Elizabeth supervised or ran John's businesses, including maintaining a liquor license for a tavern they owned. Elizabeth also began at this time to purchase and mortgage real estate, a circumstance we will visit again with another single woman of this house. All in all, Elizabeth must have had a sharp mind and acute business sense, for in April of 1683, 3 years after John's death, the tax list rates for the town assesses John Turner's widow 8 shillings in comparison to Philip English, a very wealthy merchant, who was assessed 6 shillings. The average tax levied was 2 or 3 shillings. Well done, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Roberts Turner did eventually marry a second time to Major Charles Redford, as I said, in 85. Redford lived a similar life to that of Captain Turner. He fought Indians in the French and Indian War, offered his ship Mary to the use of Her Majesty's Navy during the English conflict with the French, and commanded a cavalry troop in Her Majesty's service. He died 2 years after Elizabeth while he was on a merchant ship in Barbados. We see similar characteristics and qualities in Major Redford as we saw in Captain Turner, so apparently Elizabeth had a type. And based on his own life, these qualities were emulated in her son, John Turner II. Although we wonder how he felt when assessing the inventories of his father and stepfather's estates as he turned of age in 1691 to discover that Redford was actually insolvent and quite a bit in debt. However, it doesn't seem to have stopped John Turner II in any way. During his lifetime, he had become known respectfully as the Honorable Colonel John Turner and was described as a merchant, magistrate, soldier, representative, judge of the Court of Common Pleas, member of His Majesty's Council, and a pirate catcher. John married Mary Kitchen on May 22, 1701. He would live a long life, dying at the age of 72 in 1741 or 42. As John Turner II's life took on the same dashing and daring style of his father and stepfather, one wonders what his taste in woman ran to. If he ran toward the strong, efficient, and capable assets his mother would have modeled for him. It appears that as John Turner II was off being a Turner, his wife was at home in the same seaside mansion that his mother had raised him in. She was supervising their 7 children and 3 servants. The similarities between father and son and their wives is remarkable. Once again, we have a scenario of Colonel Turner often being away from home to fight Indians for the British Crown. According to Sidney Purley, the renowned Salem historian, in June of 1704, 3 short years after their marriage, John joined a distinguished group of 40 volunteers commanded by Major Stephen Sewall to capture the infamous pirate John Quelch. So the story of that is, in 1703, John Quelch was a lieutenant on a brigantine called the Charles Galley that sailed out of Boston. They were on a privateering expedition against the French. The English and French were constantly fighting, as we all know. So at one point, the commander of the Charles Galley took ill, and the crew allowed him to starve to death in his cabin. They then began pirating along the coast of Brazil. They aroused suspicions when they brought back an enormous treasure to Marblehead. When the authorities began questioning them, they all abandoned the vessel and fled. In June of 1704, they were discovered to be in Gloucester. They didn't go far, and Major Sewall of Salem gathered a crew of a few good men, including he was captain at the time, John Turner, and 40 others. They successfully captured the pirates and brought them back to jail in Salem in June of 1704. They were then brought to trial in Boston, and John Quelch was executed on June 30th. Although this must have been an exhilarating adventure for John, consider that back at home at the end of Turner Lane, Mary Kitchen Turner was, as her mother-in-law once was, alone in the house. She was 9 months pregnant and actually gave birth to their daughter Elizabeth on June 14th while John was away. This must have been a frightening situation for Mary, as only 6 months prior to this, she had buried their firstborn, a son, who had died the previous year, one week after his first birthday. Over the next 14 years, Elizabeth would give birth to 6 more children. Their daughter, their daughter Mary was born in 1706, and she would marry Ebenezer Bowditch and become the grandmother of the famous Nathaniel Bowditch of Practical Navigator fame. Another John, John III, was born in 1709, and he would become the heir. Eunice, shown here, was born in 1713, Robert 1715, Habuk Bathier, they're all born 16 and 18. At this time, Salem was a growing mariner mercantile town, and these children would have been at the highest level of the social ladder. We know that John III sat for his portrait, which was painted by John Simbert. I couldn't find a picture of the actual portrait of John Turner III, but the artist was very famous and did a lot of very famous people at the time, both here and in England. He was Scottish born. So he sat for this portrait. which apparently captured a well-dressed merchant clad in shimmering pea-green coat displaying the countenance of successful, wealthy, and confident young man. Shortly after this painting was completed, John married Mary Osborne and had a number of children. One of their children, Mary, would marry Daniel Sargent of Gloucester. Eventually, Mary and Daniel would move to Boston, and they would lead the effort behind the building of Long Wharf in Boston. Mary and Daniel's son, Henry Sargent, was the renowned portraitist, and another son, Lucius Manellus Sargent, became a well-known historian and writer. Sadly, John Turner III was either not as business-minded as his father and grandfather before him, or for some known circumstance arose to hamper him, for we see that on his death, for his father's death, he had inherited over 11,000 pounds. But when John died in the middle of 87, he left an estate valued at less than 60 pounds. It's a lot of money to go through. Apparently, in the middle of his life in 1764, with the consent of his wife, Mary, he began to sell off parcels of land, the wharfs, and the warehouses. And although there's not enough to know about John III and Mary Osborne, we can surmise that while they were able to maintain their social status for some time based on the marriages of their children. After years of selling off parcels of land, wharfs, warehouses, ships, and nearly all of the household goods, John Turner III eventually sold the mansion house to another wealthy mariner and merchant, Captain Samuel Ingersoll, for £550. That's still an expensive house in those days. Prior to the sale of this house, there had been a Turner connected to this house for over 114 years. Captain Samuel Ingersoll was a highly respected ship captain during the Revolutionary War. There are several petitions on record showing that ship owners such as Elias Haskett Derby and Crown and Shield and Nathaniel Silsby all petitioned Massachusetts General Council to commission Samuel to command their privateers. Samuel was married to Susanna Hathorne Ingersoll and had 5 children. Susanna, 2 who died as infants, and 2 sons who both became ship's captains. One of these sons had died at sea, and in 1804, Susanna's father Samuel went to sea with his 23-year-old son Ebenezer. And again, according to Bentley's diary and the Salem Gazette, while returning from the West Indies, both father and son developed fever. Samuel died at sea on June 15. However, Ebenezer remained alive until the ship reached Salem, only to succumb in June, while the ship lay in quarantine grounds out in Salem Harbor. Samuel had willed his property to his wife and children. It included the mansion house and its land, a wharf and wharves, and many other parcels of land throughout Salem. Upon his death, Samuel's real estate property was valued at over $13,700, and his personal property was valued at over $9,200. This was a respectable estate in 1804. Calculated to over $500,000 today, not including the increased value of the land to today's values, would put the estate value into the multi-millions. Susanna Hathorne Ingersoll was a descendant from the first families of Salem. Unlike Elizabeth Roberts Turner, who was able to keep her children alive in a dangerous and difficult environment, Susanna lost 4 out of her 5 children before her death in 1811. Upon the death of her mother, Susanna, this is Susanna here, the Essex Register, a Salem newspaper, printed, "In this town, on Friday evening last, died Madame Susanna Ingersoll, aged 65, descended from the primitive families of Salem. A lady of sound mind, firm attachment, and constant virtue. She did honor to the ancestors for whom she inherited not only their strength but their virtues." Soon after her mother's death, Susanna, the daughter, was set upon by family members who were determined to take control of the only home Susanna had known. So it is with the ferocity of tigers is how Susanna Ingersoll came into her maturity. So says the Venerable Reverend Dr. William Bentley, the prodigious chronicler of Salem history. His 4-volume diary captures the daily life and times of Salem from 1784 through 1819. Susanna and her mother had lived in the mansion until 1819, when the mother died of consumption, and Susanna inherited the estate solely, though not easily. Mrs. Ingersoll died intestate, without a will, and Dr. Bentley tells us that he was called to assist Susanna, who had swooned at the loss of her mother, but had been beset upon by family members attempting to claim the property from under her. He writes, "The death of Madame Samuel Ingersoll, a descendant from the Hollingsworth, English, and Tousell, deceased last Friday evening, and she left only a brother, John Hathorn. This morning I was with her only daughter, who had been beset by the Colonel's family with the ferocity of tigers. They insisted upon entrance into the house and apartments. The daughter had swooned upon the death of her mother and was very low. I took such charge as she desired me, for which I expect their vengeance. No prohibition could keep them out of the house. We talk of savages. What are we without our laws and penalties?" The following day, Bentley continues the saga. "Funeral of Madame Ingersoll. The Colonel's family insist upon keeping the house. I first hid the money and then the keys. It was a curious scene to me. The daughter, sick as she says, in her prison." Usually very concise Bentley, who just has volumes of being birth dates and death dates. Birth dates and death dates. Did at time have a flair. Eventually the court ordered an inventory to be completed in order to value the estate and settle the outstanding debts. And the court did eventually name Susanna the sole inheritor. Sadly, in 1811, there was no guarantee that Susanna would have inherited her mother's estate. This was very touch and go for a long time. As it was, the final execution order was not even settled until 1813, 2 years after her mother's death. Susanna's mother had increased the property holdings with her own real estate purchase. Susanna was 26 years old when her mother died, and alone in her prison by the sea. There is no doubt that Susanna, the younger, lived in an extraordinary time. To put her in context, we have her notices. She was born here in the Mansion House in 1785, 2 short years after the end of the Revolutionary War, and she died here as well in 1858 at the age of 72, 2 years before Lincoln was elected. In June of 1812, 6 months after her mother's death, President Madison declared war on England. One wonders what Susanna might have been feeling during the War of 1812, when British warships patrolled just beyond Salem Harbor, where she could very likely spy the ships from her upstairs windows. This was also an intense and dangerous time, and for the first time, Susanna would have faced these events on her own. Whether it was in response to the closeness of the war or the tragic loss of her mother, it was at this time that Susanna began an avid purchasing of real estate. As she entered into her business dealings, Susanna was identified in many of her legal documents as Susanna Ingersoll, single woman. Susanna's role in the male-dominated business of the early 19th century is only one of the intriguing aspects about her. So as the nation attempted to weather its first military conflict, Susanna showed signs that she was either a shrewd businesswoman or a bleeding heart, because in the records, they indicate that during the years of the war, from 1812 to 1815, when people along the coast and along Essex County in general were fleeing the threatening British, Susanna purchased an unprecedented 17 properties. Many of these were in Salem, but a number of them were farms and lands in Danvers and Middleton. From 1812 until the year prior to her death, she bought and sold more than 62 properties, making her the wealthiest land-rich female in New England. And here's a sampling of some of her deeds. Just a few. It's endless. So close-up of some of these deeds show very interesting traits. Susanna began her purchasing of the property in June of 1812, where she purchased a property just north of the Common. Interestingly, while she was purchasing houses in Salem, she was also mortgaging farms in Danvers and Middleton and one in Winfield. She also tended to mortgage the same properties over again. These documents show that in August 1812, She mortgaged her 58 acres of farmland in Middleton belonging to John Fuller for $250 for 1 year's time. It must not have been enough because in August she mortgaged the same parcel for $900 and again in April of 1816 for $2,300. There's no discharge notice for this property, so in the end it appears that at some point Susanna became the owner of 58 acres of farmland in Middleton that included a dwelling house, barn, and all the other buildings thereon, one half of a tract of peat meadow, as well as a pew in the Middleton meeting house. From a letter that she wrote to her adopted son Horace Conley, we know that Susanna spent a great deal of time at the farm that she purchased in Danvers, enjoying the fruits of her orchard there. Susanna continued to mortgage dozens of farms in Danvers and Middleton several times over and only discharged a few of them. Only a dozen or so were actually discharged. And if that's truly the case, and of course we're still looking into that, it's not too surprising that in the 1840s it was determined that Susanna's worth was well over $250,000 in 1840. That's a huge sum of money. If these records are an indication of Susanna's soft side, there are also records indicating that she was a strict businesswoman as well. She had no qualms about taking tenants to court for back rent. One of the other things that has come to light in Susanna's property purchase may indicate a sentimental side. Many of Susanna's Salem purchases were for parcels of land around her house here on Turner Street, but one interesting set of purchases seems to indicate that she was trying to reestablish ownership of the land that belonged to her rather famous ancestor, Mary and Philip English. Susanna was unique in that she was twice connected to the witchcraft era through her mother's side of the family, the Hathorns, and the famous Judge John Hathorn, and the Tusell line through her mother was the great-great-grandmother of Mary English, who was one of the accused people during that dangerous and frightening time. Mary's husband Philip would also be accused soon after Mary. They escaped to New York, where they remained until the hysteria was over. The Englishes were extremely rich, living in one of the stateliest houses in Salem during this era. That house was located in what we now call English Street, just down the street from here, and in November of 1818, Susanna purchased half of the property at 4 English Street. That property had been owned by her mother, but she had sold it at one point. Susanna worked to get it back in the Ingersoll name, as 1 year later, in November of 1819, she purchased the rest of the property. She purchased several other packages of land around the house and along Essex Street heading out to Salem Neck, the Willows. Was she mortgaging farms to help out farmers during the war and lucking out by their forfeitures, or was she purchasing houses in Salem for sentimental reasons, or was she hoping that the merchants' row of mansions circling the common would wind their way down Essex Street? We may never know. We know because she didn't leave a diary. We know that except for a period when she lived on a farm in Danvers, she maintained her birth home her entire life and furnished it with beautiful decorations, furniture, china, and exquisite cut glass. She honored her family and her friends by being socially concerned about the welfare of others. She was one of the strong women of the Gables, perhaps the strongest, who lived an extraordinary time. For all the history that she witnessed and participated, she has left us with more questions than answers. Susanna left her estate to Horace Conley, who clearly did not have the business sense of Susanna and eventually lost all of the money and the house, which was sold at auction in 1879 and remained empty for 4 years. In 1883, Henry and Elizabeth Upton purchased the house. Henry Upton was a musician and gave dancing lessons at Hamilton Hall. In 1895, familiar with Hawthorne's connection to the house, they began to invite guests in and charged a small fee. Thus, this was the beginning of the museum life of the house. Ida Upton, daughter of Henry and Elizabeth, began painting images of witches on glass and porcelain in 1898, which are considered some of the earliest souvenirs of Salem. Perhaps it was these circumstances that gave Caroline the notion of a museum to support her settlement endeavors. Caroline purchased the house from the Uptons in 1908, and as they say, the rest is history. Thank you.
I was under the impression until recently that own property, but obviously they
Well,
didn't have the right.
married women could not own property.
Oh,
Single
married.
woman and widows could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a
They
single
could
woman.
inherit, and that might be a reason why she never married. She
Because
certainly
and
had the standard to have been married. She was a beautiful woman. She was very social. One of her best friends was George Crowninshield, so we know that she spent a lot of time in the social aspects of Salem, which would have been dancing at Hamilton Hall, or after the recovery of the bodies of Lawrence and Ludlow during the ship battle that took place shortly just off the coast here. There was a huge procession of the bodies being brought back to town, and she hosted a party right here on the property that included the vice president at the time, Crowninshield, all of the, he had just ship's captains and first mates. They had gone up to Halifax to recover the bodies, and she had a huge party here after the fact. So she was quite involved with the city. And she was probably involved, although I haven't found a connection yet, with the anti-slavery movement, which started, the women's anti-slavery started here in Salem as well. So there was a lot going on within her lifetime that I can't imagine she was sitting in the house.
Right.
So she must have been out and about a lot, looking at properties to buy them. So.
She maybe she misjudged Mr. Upton on his finances. Or maybe his finances went downhill after she died.
Connolly? Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell me
Thank
something
you.
about the children? You said she adopted.
Horace Conley, she adopted him. We don't know exactly where he comes from. There hasn't been a connection. She, at one time, a census indicates that she had some young children, as well as an older woman living in the house. So we don't know if that was from the almshouse, the poorhouse, that she was helping people out, or if she was, the older woman was Mary Stuart Clogg, and there's a note that says she makes great pies. She might have been the cook. I mean, we don't really know.
But she invited Hawthorne here, and that's where he got the
Hawthorne was
idea.
her cousin.
Okay, so
And he
was
lived
here.
up on
Oh,
Union
okay.
Street, right up the street
But
here, so
she
he
could've
would wander
left
on
it to
down
him.
here and talk
Could have
to
left it to them.
them. They, at the time of her death, they weren't, he was in Europe most of the time, and I've yet to find any correspondence between the two.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it didn't exist, it just means we haven't located it. But she is the one who pointed out to him that the house at one time had 7
Oh,
gables.
yeah.
Anything else? Well, thanks for coming out, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And for those who would like to learn a little bit more about the life and times and legacy of Caroline Emerton, too, April 8th, we will be having an exhibit opening here at the House of the 7 Gables, which is free and open to the public. We'll have a nice party kind of celebrating Caroline's life. We also have on April 23rd will be Caroline's Community, a celebration for all. We'll have $1.50 guided tours. We have a brass band playing in the afternoon. Commonwealth Vintage dancers will be here. We have historic candy from Yule Pepper Candy Company across the street. We have a pop-up picnic tent. Lots of fun going on April 23rd. So we welcome you to come and learn about, our most recent strong woman of the Gables and owner of the Gables. But otherwise, thank you very much to Robin, and we have a gift to present to you as well. It's just a token of appreciation for taking time out of your day to be here with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're very
Julie. That's
welcome.
very sweet of you.
Thank you.